Hello, this is Professor James Strickler. This is a course in American government. This lesson is from Unit 3 about American federalism, and it's Lesson 12 concerning the New Deal and the Great Society. In this lesson, you'll learn about the New Deal, you'll learn about the Great Society, and you'll learn about the Commerce Clause. This lesson is one of a series about historical changes to American federalism. In previous lessons, we learned about the Hamiltonian Economic Program and the American Civil War. And in this lesson, we'll learn about the New Deal and the Great Society. The Great Depression set the stage for the New Deal. The Great Depression was a decade-long, severe economic downturn in the United States and really across the world. It took place in the 1930s. A large percentage of the American population was out of work. Business was doing very badly. And in the midst of this, there was a giant political turnover. The Democratic Party seized control of the entire national government, overwhelmingly electing Franklin Roosevelt as President of the United States. And when President Franklin Roosevelt took office, he did so with a plan in mind for the country, which became known as the New Deal. That name comes from his acceptance speech when he became the Democratic nominee for president in 1932. He pledged a new deal for the American people, as he put it. That New Deal had a lot of aspects to it. We're going to highlight 4 of them in this lesson. The first of those was a set of programs designed to create government jobs. Now remember, I said that a large percentage of the population was out of work. So President Roosevelt and the other Democrats that controlled the Congress thought that it would be important just to get people to work somehow. So they passed a series of laws that were designed to simply make up jobs for people. One of these programs created the Civilian Conservation Corps. It's a good example to remember, where people were hired to go out and, for example, just plant trees, cut trails through the wilderness, dig ditches, things like that. Basically, any young man that could swing an axe or push a shovel in the ground could be hired to go out and do these things. So there's our first item in the New Deal, the creation of government jobs, with the Civilian Conservation Corps being but one example of the many programs that they created to do this. Next element of the New Deal was a series of government regulations concerning labor. Now, what we're talking about here is the ability of workers to organize and collectively bargain, to essentially say to their employer, rather than you just dealing with me coming in asking for a raise and firing me and then be able to replace me easily, the whole group of us are going to come in and ask for a raise at once. And if you fire all of us at the same time, then you're going to have a hard problem because your factory is going to shut down while you hire new people and retrain them. So it might be just cheaper to give us a raise. Well, employers are worried about unions costing them too much money. So they would try to nip unions in the bud. As soon as they heard someone talking about organizing a union, they would try to get rid of that person. Well, the national government then decided, as part of the New Deal legislation, to provide protections for workers and ways to force their employers to allow them to organize and even to give in to their demands. So there's a second element of the New Deal, to protect labor unions. Third element of the New Deal can be seen in these posters from the time period, where it's introducing the idea of Social Security, where when a person reached a certain age, they could retire and they would get payments from the government. Or if the breadwinner in the family were to die, then the dependents that were left behind, such as a mother with young children, would also get checks from the government. This then gives our third element of the New Deal, that it would provide Social Security for people. The fourth element of the New Deal, illustrated with these photos, is that the national government was going to set quotas on production In other words, tell manufacturers and farmers, etc., how much of their product they could create. And it would also set prices, telling them what they could sell their product for. Now, this was done to try to control the markets, to make sure that there wasn't too much of something so it would drive down the price. Or if that couldn't be done, to simply require that the price be a certain thing. So the fourth element of the New Deal we want to talk about is the control of production and prices. Now, please notice at this point that you may think that these are all good ideas, things that the government should do, or maybe you don't think that they are. That's not really the question here about whether these are good or bad policies of the government. The question we're trying to consider is what this is doing to the balance of power within the country. As the government asserts doing these things, where in the Constitution do they find justification for it? Are they trying to add new powers? Are they trying to take powers away from the states to do these things? Are they doing so legitimately? So keep that in mind as we now consider Great Society programs. The Great Society came along about 30 years after the New Deal. A man named Lyndon Johnson was president of the United States then. He had been in Congress during the time of the New Deal, and he was a great admirer of Franklin Roosevelt. And when he became president, he wanted to create a similar big program to, in his mind, try to make the country a better place. Now, among the important things that inspired his Great Society program was the Civil Rights Movement, as African Americans and their supporters demanded that they be treated equally to whites in the country. Well, in response to things like the Civil Rights Movement, Lyndon Johnson, as President of the United States, declared that he wanted to create a great society. And what he meant by that was a society that would demand an end to poverty and racial injustice, among other things, in which the needs of the body and the demands of commerce, as he puts it, would not be the only things that we would be concerned with, but also beauty and community and things like that, where we'd be less concerned about the quantity of the goods that we have and more about their quality, those sorts of things. He wanted America to become a place that, in his mind, would be fairer to all economically. We're going to discuss 5 elements of his Great Society program. The first of those elements is that he wanted to end private racial segregation. In other words, the authority that private business owners had up to this point to decide who they would serve in their establishment. If somebody wanted to put up a sign that says whites only, they could do that up to this time. If someone else wanted to put up a sign that says blacks only, they could have done that also. President Johnson wanted to end that. So the first element of his Great Society program is to end private discrimination. Next thing he wanted to do was add a whole bunch of new government programs to help the less fortunate in society, such as Medicare, that provides a kind of health insurance for older Americans, Medicaid, that provide a kind of health insurance for poorer Americans, food stamps, where the government would give people coupons to go buy food. And he also wanted to liberalize Social Security, in other words, make more people eligible for it, not just retired people and people who had the breadwinner that die in the family, but, for example, disabled people. So in a general sense, what he wanted to do is he wanted to expand government welfare programs to help people that he believed couldn't provide for themselves. Third element of the Great Society is that he wanted to allow federal funding for public education. In other words, the national government would provide money for elementary schools, high schools, colleges, etc. around the country. But when they did so, they would do it with what we call strings attached. In other words, there would be rather various government rules and regulations that these schools would then have to agree to follow to get the money. So he wanted to regulate public education throughout the country, with the national government now in charge of it. He also wanted to create funding for the arts and the humanities. The result of this was the founding of the National Endowment for the Arts and the National Endowment for the Humanities. In this way, the national government would then start funding arts and humanities throughout the country. The fifth element of his program that we want to highlight here dealt with environmental quality. A whole series of laws were passed while he was president, dealing with these things like the Clean Water Act and the Clean Air Act, the Water Quality Act, the Wilderness Act, the Endangered Species Act, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. There were a whole bunch of environmental laws that were passed while he was president. So he wanted to use the power of the national government to protect the environment. Well, as I said a moment ago when we were talking about the New Deal, as you look at these programs that Lyndon Johnson and the Congress that was loyal to him created, please don't just think about them of whether or not you think they're good ideas for what government should do. Instead, think about, where did the national government get the power to do these things? And did it have to grab power from the states in order to do them? Be very specific. These programs are authorized by what enumerated power in the Constitution? Well, let's look at the list of enumerated powers and try to find where it would say that you could have environmental programs or prohibit racial discrimination, or that you could set up a Social Security program. Well, if you go through these enumerated powers carefully, it's not obvious where any of them say that you can do these things. So what made FDR think that he could set up the New Deal and Lyndon Johnson set up the Great Society? Well, they both believed that the power to regulate commerce is where they could find the justification for their programs. Here's what the Constitution actually says on that point. It says that the Congress will have power to regulate commerce with foreign nations and among the several states. The way this was always understood up until the time of the New Deal was that commerce among the states meant buying and selling things across state lines. This goes back to the original desire to create the United States Constitution. Remember, the states were having trouble doing business with each other. There were too many taxes and regulations on their border that were making trade difficult. And they wanted to make those uniform and fair throughout the country, so they gave this power over to the national government. The states presumed, though, that they could still continue to regulate commerce within their own boundaries. And that's the way it was understood for a long time in our country's history, that the Commerce Clause simply said that the national government would set uniform rules across the country for trade being shipped across state lines. Now, let's review what we learned in this lesson. We're going to learn more about these things in the next lesson to come. Let's review what we've learned to this point. What prompted the New Deal? Was it World War II? Was it the Roaring Twenties? Was it the Great Depression? Or was it World War I? The New Deal was prompted by the economic despair of the Great Depression, which then caused people to turn to the national government looking for help. Which was a New Deal program? The National Endowment for the Arts, food stamps, Social Security, or the Endangered Species Act? It was Social Security. Those other programs were part of Lyndon Johnson's Great Society. What helped prompt the Great Society? Was it the Gulf War, the stock market crash, the Summer of Love, or the Civil Rights Movement? It was the Civil Rights Movement, which directly led to Lyndon Johnson's call to end discrimination and indirectly led to his desire to create more jobs and things like that, provide a larger social safety net for people. Which was a Great Society program? Was it the Civilian Conservation Corps? Was it food stamps? Was it the Affordable Care Act or the National Labor Act? Great Society program was food stamps. This was among the programs that we specifically mentioned earlier in this lesson. The other programs listed here all took place at a different time. What is the constitutional justification for the New Deal and the Great Society? Was it the provision in Article 1, Section 8 that allows borrowing money, or the one that allows regulating interstate commerce, or the power granted to regulate bankruptcy, or the enumerated power to collect taxes? It was the power to regulate interstate commerce that these presidents relied on, and the Congresses that helped them relied on as their justification for creating these programs. Our next lesson will be from Unit 3. It'll be Lesson 12, and it will revolve around the Supreme Court case of Wickard versus Filburn.